The cruelest jokes are born in the bitter dregs of whiskey glasses, spoken by men whose souls are as cracked and barren as the alkali flats they ride over. My was the punchline. Pushed forward from the shadows of the saloon by rough, calloused hands, she was given her instructions amidst a chorus of snickering. A bucket of lye soap, a coarse brush, and a destination, the isolated homestead of Jonah Thorne, the man they called the Beast of Caldera Ridge. The joke was simple, sharp, and meant to draw blood. She was to offer to bathe him. They imagined his rage, her terror, the satisfying spectacle of a fragile thing breaking against an immovable object. For her, it was not a joke but a command she could not refuse, for the men who sent her held the flimsy paper that claimed ownership of her passage, of her very breath. So she walked, the bucket handle biting into her palm, the setting sun bleeding across the horizon, painting the unforgiving landscape in hues of rust and dried blood. The path to his cabin was a faint scar on the land, a suggestion of a trail that few ever traveled. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of juniper trees, carrying the scent of dust and a profound loneliness that seemed to seep from the soil itself. She trembled, but not from the cold. It was the deep, resonant fear of a cornered animal, the knowledge that behind her lay the cackling wolves and ahead, the den of the bear. When she finally saw the cabin, it was less a home than a wound on the hillside, a dark shape hunched against the twilight. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a lonely grey banner against a bruised purple sky. There were no lights in the windows, no signs of life save for that ghostly plume. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to flee into the wilderness and take her chances with the coyotes and the cold. But the faces of the men in town, their mean, expectant eyes, were a more immediate terror. She took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass and approached the heavy oak door. Her knock was a small, desperate sound, swallowed by the immense silence of the place. For a long moment, nothing happened. She could hear the jeering laughter of her tormentors echoing in her memory, and she raised her hand to knock again, a tear of pure despair freezing on her cheek. Then, the door creaked open. Jonah Thorne stood framed in the doorway, a giant of a man whose shadow seemed to devour the last of the fading light. His face was a landscape of its own, carved with lines of grief and hardship, a thick beard unable to soften the harsh set of his jaw. His eyes, though, were what held her. They were not filled with the feral rage she had been promised, but with a weary, ancient sorrow. He looked at her, at the bucket, at the brush, and then past her, toward the distant ridge where he knew the vultures would be watching. A flicker of understanding, of shared disgust for the world's casual cruelty, passed through his gaze. He didn't speak. He simply stepped aside, a silent invitation into the heart of his desolation. The door closed behind her with a sound of finality, shutting out the world and sealing her fate within the four walls of his grief. The air inside was thick with the scent of cold ash, pine wood, and something else, something metallic and sorrowful, like a forgotten memory. A fire guttered low in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows that made the sparse room seem cavernous and haunted. A single wooden table and two chairs stood in the center, their surfaces scrubbed bare. A worn rifle rested against the wall. It was a space stripped of all comfort, a shelter meant for survival, not living. Mai stood clutching the bucket, her knuckles white. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Jonah did not look at her. He moved to the hearth and placed another log on the embers, his movements deliberate and devoid of any wasted energy. Sparks flew up, briefly illuminating the stark plains of his face. He then gestured with his chin toward a large copper basin near the fire, the one used for laundry, for bathing, for all the necessary ablutions of a solitary life. The cruel joke hung in the air, unspoken but understood. He was not demanding she perform the task, but he was not stopping her either. It was a test, a question asked without words. "What will you do now that the jesters are gone?" Mai's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was the moment. She could set the bucket down, retreat into a corner, and wait for whatever came next. Or she could see this grotesque pantomime through to its conclusion. With a resolve born of a lifetime of enduring the unendurable, she moved toward the hearth. She filled the basin with water from a nearby pail, her hands shaking so badly that water sloshed onto the stone floor. She added the harsh soap, the lie stinging her nostrils. She did not look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on her task. He remained by the fire, his back to her. He began to unbutton his shirt, the worn flannel parting to reveal the broad expanse of his back. And that is when she saw it. That is when a fear deeper and more profound than any she had ever known seized her, a fear that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the world that had made him. His back was not the flesh of a man, it was a ruined tapestry of pain. A lattice of thick, raised scars, bleached white with time, crisscrossed from his shoulders to his waist, the unmistakable signature of a whip. Interspersed among them were the puckered, melted shapes of old burns, twisting the skin into grotesque patterns. It was a history of agony written onto his very being. She saw not a beast, but a man who had been systematically broken, a soul that had been tortured far beyond the limits of human endurance. And in his scars, she saw the reflection of her own, the invisible wounds that riddled her spirit. Her fear of him evaporated, replaced by a cold, trembling horror at the shared cruelty they had both survived. The bucket slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the stone with a sound that shattered the oppressive silence. Jonah didn't flinch, didn't turn. He remained a statue of suffering, his scarred back a testament to a past he could never escape. Mai stared, her breath caught in her throat. The men's laughter, the cruel joke, it all seemed so petty now, so profoundly ignorant. They had sent her to mock a monster, but she had found a martyr. Her fear transformed into a wave of empathy so powerful it threatened to pull her under. She saw the years of torment etched into his skin and understood the fortress of silence he had built around himself. It was not a wall of anger, but a bastion of pain. Slowly, deliberately, she knelt and picked up the washcloth. She dipped it into the warm, soapy water, her movements becoming steady, her purpose clear. This was no longer a humiliating task. It was a sacrament. She approached him, her heart a steady, solemn drum. Her first touch was hesitant, a light brush of the cloth against the unscarred skin of his shoulder. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles, the first crack in his stoic facade. He had not been touched with gentleness in a lifetime. She continued, her motions now sure and rhythmic. She did not scrub at the scars, but cleansed the skin around them, her touch a silent apology for the cruelty of the world. The lye soap was harsh, but her hands were gentle. She was not washing a man's body, she was tending to a sacred ruin, honoring the history of his survival. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer empty but filled with a heavy, unspoken communion. He did not speak. She did not speak. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of the cloth against his skin. When she was finished, she moved away, her duty done. He remained with his back to her for a long moment before slowly putting his shirt back on, buttoning it up as if sealing his history away once more. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. The sorrow was still there, but it was joined by something else, a flicker of bewildered gratitude. He gestured to a small, closed door in the corner of the cabin. "You can sleep there," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken. The room was small, containing only a narrow bed with a patched quilt. It smelled of lavender and cedar, a ghost of a feminine presence. He had given her his late wife's room. The cruel joke had ended not in violence or humiliation, but in a quiet, fragile truce born from the mutual recognition of pain. She had been sent to his home as a punchline, but she had stayed as something else entirely, something neither of them yet had a name for. In the days that followed, an unspoken routine settled over the desolate cabin. Mai rose before the sun, her quiet movements a stark contrast to the heavy stillness that had long pervaded the home. She rekindled the fire, her small form casting a warm glow in the pre-dawn gloom. She found sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, and a small, neglected vegetable patch out back. Her hands, which had trembled with fear, now found purpose in kneading dough, in sorting lentils, in coaxing life back into the hardened soil. The cabin began to change. The scent of dust and sorrow was slowly replaced by the aroma of baking bread and simmering stew. She mended the threadbare curtains, her neat, precise stitches a small act of defiance against the decay. She swept the floors, polished the single pane of glass in the window until it shone, and washed Jonah's clothes, hanging them to dry on a line strung between two pines where they flapped like prayer flags in the constant wind. Jonah watched her, a silent observer from the periphery. He would leave for hours at a time, returning with a brace of rabbits or a cut of firewood, which he would deposit by the door without a word. He never acknowledged her work directly, but she would notice a fresh pail of milk on the table in the morning, or a handful of wild berries left on the porch. These were his words, his quiet admissions that her presence was making a difference. He was a man who spoke in actions, and she was learning to read his silent language. The house, once a tomb of his grief, was slowly, imperceptibly, breathing again. The warmth from the hearth seemed to reach a little further into the corners. The light from the polished window seemed a little brighter. She was not trying to erase the ghost of his wife, she was simply chasing away the ghosts of neglect and despair. She was bringing order to his chaos, warmth to his cold, and life to a place that had long been forgotten by it. Her quiet transformation of the space was a reflection of the quiet transformation beginning within him, a gentle thawing of a heart that had been frozen for years. He still wore his pain like a shroud, but now, a small pinprick of light was beginning to pierce the darkness. The first time she saw the child, it was as if a ghost had materialized from the shadows. A small girl, no older than 6, with Jonah's dark, serious eyes and a tangle of hair the color of straw. She stood in the doorway of the main room, clutching a small, crudely carved wooden bird, her thumb stuck firmly in her mouth. She watched me with a solemn, unnerving intensity. This was Lily, the other silent occupant of the house of grief. Jonah had never mentioned her, another piece of his heart he kept locked away. Mai's presence had finally drawn the child out from her hiding place. Mai did not startle or press. She simply offered a small, soft smile and continued her work, pretending not to notice the little phantom observing her every move. She understood that, like her father, the girl needed to be approached with a patience that bordered on reverence. The next day, Mai baked a small honey cake and left a piece on the lowest step of the ladder that led to the loft where Lily slept. She did not watch to see if it was taken. The following morning, the plate was empty. This became their ritual. A small offering, a quiet acceptance. Mai mended a tear in the girl's dress, leaving it folded on her bed. She found a ribbon in her own meager belongings and tied it to the wooden bird's neck. She never forced an interaction, never demanded a response. She simply made her gentle presence known, a steady, reliable warmth in a world that had offered the child nothing but cold silence. One afternoon, as Mai was kneading dough, a tiny shadow fell over the table. Lily stood before her, holding out the wooden bird. "Mama made it," she whispered, the word small and fragile, the first she had spoken to Mai. It was an offering of trust, a sharing of the most precious piece of her shattered world. Mai carefully wiped the flour from her hands and took the bird, cradling it as if it were a living thing. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. She found a small tin of beeswax and a soft cloth and showed the child how to polish the wood, bringing out the grain and making the simple carving gleam. From the corner of the room, Jonah watched them, his face unreadable, but a profound shift was occurring behind his stoic mask. The bridge between the woman and the child was being built, and he was beginning to wonder if, just maybe, it was strong enough to bear his own weight. Lily became Mai's shadow, her small hand often finding its way into Mai's as they tended the garden or collected eggs from the 2 scrawny hens behind the cabin. The child's silence began to fracture, replaced by a stream of questions, the kind of simple, profound inquiries only a child can make. Why was the sky blue? Where did the sun sleep at night? Mai answered each one with a gentle seriousness that validated the child's curiosity. Jonah remained on the periphery of this burgeoning warmth, a planet held in orbit by a sun he dared not approach too closely. But he was listening. He heard the murmur of their voices, the sound of Lily's rare, breathy laugh. These sounds were like rain on parched earth, awakening feelings he had long since buried. One evening, as the 3 of them sat in the relative warmth of the hearth, a comfortable silence settled between them. Jonah was mending a piece of tack, his large hand surprisingly nimble. Mai was sewing a button onto Lily's coat. Lily, who was leaning against Mai's side, looked up, her expression one of deep contemplation. She looked from Mai's focused face to her father's shadowed one. "Does your heart hurt, too?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the quiet of the room. The question was not directed at anyone in particular, yet it was meant for them both. It hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline truth. Mai's hand stilled. She looked at the child, then her gaze slowly lifted to meet Jonah's across the firelight. For the first time, she allowed him to see past her placid exterior, to glimpse the vast, sorrowful landscape of her own past. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. One single, honest gesture that said everything. "Yes. Mine hurts, too." In that moment, something in Jonah's chest, something that had been frozen solid for years, cracked. He saw her not as the woman from the saloon, not as a housekeeper or a stray he had taken in, but as a fellow traveler in the unforgiving wilderness of grief. He saw the strength it took for her to nod, to admit her pain without words or weeping. He looked away, back at the leather in his hands, but the admission had struck its mark. Later that night, long after Lily was asleep in the loft, Mai found a cup of cooled chamomile tea on the table beside her bed. And next to it, a single, perfect eagle feather. It was his answer. It was his nod back to her. A silent acknowledgement of a shared and terrible burden. The world turned white overnight. A blizzard descended from the mountains without warning, a furious, shrieking ghost that clawed at the small cabin, burying them in a sea of snow. The wind howled like a starving wolf, and the world shrank to the four walls of their shelter. They were utterly, completely isolated. For 2 days, the storm raged, and an uneasy peace held within the cabin. They were warm, they had food, and the fury outside made their small space feel like the only sane place in the world. But on the third night, Lily began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the scraping of the wind. By morning, she was burning with fever. Jonah's carefully constructed composure shattered. He touched his daughter's forehead, and a raw, primal fear contorted his features. He had seen this before. This was the same fire that had consumed his wife, a fever that had stolen her from him in the dead of a merciless winter just like this one. He was paralyzed, a giant of a man rendered helpless by the ghost of a past failure. He saw not his daughter, but his dying wife. He felt not the present crisis, but the echoes of his own powerlessness. He backed away from the small bed, his breath coming in ragged bursts, the walls of the cabin closing in on him. It was Mai who moved into the space he vacated. Her calm was a stark contrast to his rising panic. She placed a cool, damp cloth on Lily's forehead, her touch firm and reassuring. She had seen this fever in the crowded ships, in the squalid camps. She knew its face. While Jonah paced the floor like a caged animal, trapped in the nightmare of his memories, Mai took charge. She found the small store of herbs she had gathered from the hillsides in late autumn, yarrow to break the fever, mullein for the cough. She brewed a pungent tea, forcing the warm liquid past Lily's dry lips. She bathed the child's small, hot body in cool water, murmuring soft, soothing words in a language he didn't understand but whose gentle cadence was a balm to the terror in the room. She did not sleep, did not rest. She was a vigilant sentinel, a warrior fighting a battle against an invisible enemy, and her quiet competence was the only anchor in the storm, both inside and out. The night was a long, dark crucible. The blizzard raged on, its voice a constant, terrifying moan against the logs of the cabin. Inside, another storm was breaking. Lily's fever climbed, and she drifted in and out of a restless, delirious sleep, crying out for her mother. Each cry was a fresh blade in Jonah's heart. He sat slumped in a chair by the hearth, his head in his hands, the picture of defeat. He was lost in the past, drowning in the memory of his wife's final, ragged breaths. He had tried to save her from the fire that had scarred his back, had held her as the life fled her body, his own strength utterly useless against the flames and the sickness that followed. Now, watching his daughter suffer, he felt that same crushing impotence. Mai, seeing his torment, moved from Lily's bedside. She poured him a mug of strong, black coffee and pressed it into his hands, forcing him to look at her. "She is not her mother," Mai said, her voice quiet but firm. This is not the same fire. Her words were a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of his grief. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow with fear and sorrow. The shared vigil in the dim, flickering light stripped away their defenses, leaving them raw and vulnerable. And so, he began to speak. The words came haltingly at first, then like a river breaking through a dam of ice. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, of her laughter that used to fill the cabin, of the fire set by raiders that took everything. He told her how he had pulled her from the burning barn, his own back alight with flames, only to lose her to the fever that set in from her burns days later. I couldn't hold on, he choked out, the words tasting like ash and failure. I failed them as he spoke, I listened, her presence a silent, unwavering anchor. When his story was finished, the cabin was quiet save for the storm and Lily's shallow breathing. Then, Mai spoke, her own voice barely a whisper. She told him of her village in a faraway land, of the famine that forced her father to sell her. She spoke of the suffocating darkness in the belly of a ship, of the fear and degradation that had been her constant companions. She spoke of arriving in this new, hard country with nothing but a name she was forced to change and a spirit that refused to break. Their stories, born of different worlds, different tragedies, were the same in their essence. They were stories of loss, of survival, of being left behind. In that long, dark night, as the storm howled its fury, two broken souls laid their scars bare, and in the shared darkness, found the first, faint glimmer of a shared light. When the dawn finally came, it was to a world of profound silence and blinding white. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in snow, beautiful and treacherous. Inside the cabin, the fever had also broken. Lily was sleeping peacefully, her skin cool to the touch, her breathing deep and even. A fragile, exhausted peace settled over the small home. But the world outside was not content to leave them to it. Later that day, 3 figures on horseback appeared, dark shapes moving slowly against the snow-bright horizon. It was Harker and his men, the architects of the cruel joke that had brought Mai to this place. Boredom and the end of the storm had made them restless, and they had ridden out to the Thorn homestead for some sport. They saw Mai outside, gathering a bucket of clean snow to melt for water. Harker's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, look what the storm blew in," he called out, his voice a vulgar intrusion into the clean silence. "Thought the beast might have eaten you by now," his men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. They dismounted, their intentions clear. "We've come to collect our property," Harker said, his eyes lingering on Mai with a possessive leer. "You ran out on your debt to us." He reached for her arm, intending to drag her back to the town that served as her prison. Before his fingers could touch her, the cabin door swung open. Jonah filled the doorway, his sheer size seeming to block out the sun. He was not the haunted recluse they remembered. The crucible of the storm and the fever had forged something new in him. His eyes, clear and cold as glacial ice, fixed on Harker. He stepped off the porch and moved to stand between Mai and the men, a silent, immovable wall of protection. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority rolling off him was more menacing than any shout. "She is home," he said, the words low and final. "You will not touch her." It was not a request. It was a declaration, a drawing of a line in the pristine snow, a public claim made before the hostile world. Harker, fueled by whiskey and arrogance, scoffed at the quiet threat. "She belongs to the company that paid her passage, Thorn. That's the law. Now step aside." He made the fatal mistake of trying to push past Jonah. The movement that followed was shockingly fast. Jonah's hand shot out, not in a punch, but in a precise, calculated motion, seizing Harker's outstretched wrist. The crack of bone was unnaturally loud in the frozen air, a sharp, sickening punctuation to his words. Harker screamed, a raw, animal sound of pain and disbelief, stumbling back and clutching his broken arm. The other 2 men froze, their smirks vanishing, replaced by a primal fear. They had come to taunt a broken man, they had found something else entirely. Jonah's gaze swept over them, his expression one of cold, lethal promise. "This land is mine," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a roar. "This house is mine. And she is mine to protect." The word, mine, was not one of ownership, but of fierce, undeniable responsibility. A vow. "Leave," he commanded. And do not return, it was a banishment. Harker's men, without a second thought, scrambled to help their groaning leader onto his horse. They fled, their retreat clumsy and panicked, leaving churned, dirty snow in their wake. The threat was gone. Jonah stood for a moment, watching them disappear over the ridge, his body a rigid line of defiance. Then, slowly, he turned back to Mai. The cold fire in his eyes softened as he looked at her. He saw the lingering fear in her expression, but beneath it, something new was taking root, a fragile, hesitant trust. He saw the bucket she had dropped, its contents spilled across the snow. Without a word, he bent down, his large frame seeming to fold in on itself, and picked it up. As he straightened, he held it out to her, and his knuckles brushed against the back of her hand. It was the first time he had initiated a gentle touch. It was not born of necessity or accident, but of a simple, profound desire to connect. A current passed between them, warm and startling in the cold air, a silent acknowledgement that everything had changed. They were no longer just two survivors under one roof, they were a fortress, and they had just won their first battle. The seasons turned, melting the deep snows of the blizzard into memory. Spring arrived with a quiet, determined grace, coaxing green shoots from the hard-packed earth and painting the hillsides with the fragile colors of wildflowers. The transformation of the land was mirrored in the small cabin on Caldera Ridge. The heavy shroud of grief that had clung to the walls for so long had finally lifted, replaced by something warm and resilient. The silence was different now. It was no longer a chasm of unspoken pain but a comfortable, shared space, punctuated by the sounds of a life being rebuilt. The rare, breathy sound of Lily's laughter became more common as she and Mai spent hours in the sun, their heads bent together over the burgeoning vegetable garden. Jonah began to work with a renewed purpose, his movements losing their heavy, mournful quality. He repaired the fences, reshingled the roof, and tilled a new field for planting, his powerful form moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. The home was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a homestead. One evening, Mai noticed him sitting on the porch, a block of pine and a small, sharp knife in his hands. He was carving, his focus absolute, the shavings falling like soft curls of snow at his feet. She remembered the small, crude bird Lily cherished, the last relic of her mother. He was reclaiming a part of himself he had buried with his wife. Days later, as the sun bled its final, golden light across the vast expanse of the sky, the three of them sat on the porch steps. A comfortable quiet enveloped them, a peace that had been hard-earned. Lily, exhausted from a day of play, had fallen asleep in Mai's lap, her small body relaxed in utter trust. Jonah, who had been sitting beside them, reached over. He did not say a word. He simply opened his hand and placed what he had been carving into Mai's free palm. It was a bird, a sandpiper, exquisitely detailed, its head cocked as if listening for the sound of a distant ocean. It was a companion to the one his wife had carved, not a replacement, but an addition. A new piece to their story. Mai's fingers closed around the smooth, warm wood. She looked from the perfect carving to his face, her eyes conveying a gratitude too deep for words. He met her gaze, and in the quiet space between them, a universe of understanding passed. No vows were spoken. No promises were made. None were needed. The two wooden birds, one old and one new, told the entire story. In the heart of an unforgiving wilderness, a family had been forged, not from blood or law, but from the ashes of shared sorrow and the quiet, stubborn resilience of two broken hearts that had, against all odds, learned to beat as one. The cruel joke had brought her to his door, but grace, in its mysterious and patient way, had invited her in to stay.